Hi, folks. We are very happy to welcome today Doug from San Diego Blood Bank, right? An organization that Profit.co is very proud to be associated with, right? Providing great service to the community. So welcome, Doug. And would love to get know more about you, your career, and of course about San Diego Blood Bank. The mission of the organization, and what you've been doing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time today. So the San Diego Blood Bank was formed in 1950, so we're celebrating our 75th year this year. Our mission is to save and improve lives through blood and biotherapies. We're a nonprofit I like to tell people we're a nonprofit pharmaceutical. We have all the same regulations for drugs and that sort of thing on a much smaller budget. So being efficient is really important, and so that's where some of the performance management comes into play for us.
Okay, that's awesome. And in terms of before we really jump into OKRs and your experience, can you tell us as an organization for San Diego Blood Bank, and I think you put it very nicely that performing services at the same time you're also regulated, right, almost like a pharmaceutical company. But in terms of your broader goals of the organization, as well as some of the challenges, right, as an organization to fulfill your mission, right? Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, so we rely our raw materials, if you will, right? The volunteer donors, right? So there's a whole challenge there with regard to, particularly in a scenario where we have, lower birth rates throughout the U.S. There's a lower percentage of people that are jumping into becoming blood donors because some of the younger population. So there's a whole kind of marketing and education aspect about the importance of blood donation. So that's on kind of one side of the argument. As the population is aging, so we have an inverting population pyramid. As the population is aging, actually the use for blood is going up among those populations. So there's a challenge that we have to solve there across the country. Additionally, we're moving into other areas, cell therapy, for example, as we look at what the future holds, because while ensuring a safe blood supply is critical, we've been doing this for 75 years, also looking at what's the future of healthcare. And one of the roles that we're playing is around like healthy leukopaks from healthy donors, for feeder cells for future cell therapy products.
Okay, that's awesome. And I think the challenges that you have laid out, the inverted, population curve, right, or pyramid, I never thought about it, and as you speak about it, absolutely makes sense, right? It's a huge challenge, right? So with this background, right, how did you decide on OKRs as a strategy execution framework, right? So how did that come up? Who brought the idea? What was the initial scope? Maybe you can share some insights.
Yeah, I read the book Measure What Matters, and I think that's where started to think about how that would work in our organization. We have so many things going on, right? FDA regulations always changing, new challenges with recruiting donors. The challenge sometimes is that there's so many projects going on, it's hard to know where to focus. And so the idea of trying to simplify in a sense and really drive prioritization, at least starting with our leadership team and then down through the organization, that was really the driver.
Okay, great. And how big is San Diego Blood Bank today in terms of the number of people and any other parameters?
We have about 335 employees. We service hospitals throughout all of Southern California.
Okay, that's awesome. So, when you and how long back did you decide that you are going to try out OKRs?
So it's probably maybe 18 months or so.
Okay.
So we're ending the first full year. Our budget year runs from July to June. So we're coming up on the end of our first year actually implementing. Probably 6 months prior to the end of last year, we started looking at how we could rethink our goals a little bit.
Okay, sure. So you've been implementing for the past 18 months. I mean, not considering the technology question, overall, as a framework, right? You look at OKRs, right? You are defining it at the organizational level, and then you are cascading it down, right? What has been your experience with OKRs as a strategy execution framework, right? Has there been any challenges? How has been the journey so far?
Yeah, so it's been a learning experience, but it's been good to really focus on, okay, these are the top items, with the understanding is that there's still ongoing work that has to happen regardless, but these are the top focus areas. So it allowed us from a leadership team perspective to really identify those top areas, establish some key metrics around those specific areas. Um, some of the challenges have been, so I think that's been really good, and we can communicate that organizationally. The challenge, and it's really just a learning curve, which is how do we pull the other departments into that, right? So that um, an individual department can understand how what they're doing is actually feeding into some of our OKRs. And it could be separating the idea of tactics from strategy is part of that conversation. So it's just an education all the way through the organization. But it's been good. It's just been a process.
Okay, great. And when you first started implementing OKRs, did people have confusion about OKRs versus employee performance management? Did any of those questions arise, or was it clear from the set go?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of the typical confusion between um, what's a strategic initiative versus, again, tactics and trying to separate that out. And well, if it's not one of our OKRs, does that mean it's not important? We don't still need to do it, right?
Mhm.
Still have to keep the lights on, still have to keep the blood flowing in the hospitals. That's what we do. And yet, these are the specific strategic areas we're focusing on.
Sure. And uh, so far in these 18 months of your journey in implementing OKRs, if you say your top three challenges, right, what would you say have been your top three challenges in implementing OKRs?
Um, so one would be just making sure we dial in the appropriate measurements, right? So kind of a combination of leading and lagging indicators, right? And so that's been, so we, as we went through this, we would develop some and then realize that we were missing critical measurements. So, one of our, as we developed our OKRs, we're trying to make those aspirational in a sense, right? These big goals.
Sure.
And so one of our OKRs this year is an exceptional blood supply, because we wanted to go beyond just having adequate supply. We really wanted to this idea of exceptional. And so then some of the measurements that were how we're thinking about measuring those, we needed to perfect over time. So that's been one of them. Again, communication, as I said, down to the individual departments, so they don't feel siloed. So it's not just somebody developing their own little OKR or KPI over here and don't see how it fits into the big picture. So that's mostly an educational one. Um, and then lastly, just trying to coalesce around how we report that out in a consistent fashion that's clear and understandable and concise.
Great. That's very helpful. So you decided that you will implement OKRs and you will execute your strategy using this framework. At what point did you decide that you would need a tool to implement, and how was that decision made to choose Profit.co?
Um, so yeah, again, as I indicated, reading about that process, right, there's clearly some templates and some free tools and some Excel spreadsheets and whatnot. but some of it was just the ability to track. It was just too much work manually. So we did try some different software solutions. I honestly don't know who found Profit Code, where that came from, but
Mm.
once we started working with you guys, there was just a lot of good back and forth. You guys trying to understand a little bit of our business, what we're trying to accomplish, us still trying to learn, right? How do we implement OKRs? What's the best way? So it's just been a good partnership from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. You're absolutely right. It's been a great partnership. So how was the experience, onboarding Profit.co? How did you feel? How did your team members feel about the onboarding
Yeah,
process?
I think it was probably a little overwhelming at first, right? Just a lot of, like any software, there's all these options, but I think as we dove into it, and then once we got our feet wet and we started to understand how we utilize the software, um, also as we, kind of made our own improvements in terms of some of our metrics and things that we're measuring, um, then to have your team come back and give us more of a deep dive, right? Now that you have some understanding, to have some of our key leaders, right, do a deep dive on the system was really helpful. So now we have kind of our go-to subject matter experts that other department heads can go talk to if they're trying to understand, right, how they should best implement for their department.
Okay, got it. And during technology implementation, you said initially it was a little bit overwhelming. And how did your team get over that bump? And how did they become comfortable with the tool? Doug?
Yeah, I think it was really just through training and use and iteration, right? So having your team join our quarterly business reviews to walk through the performance, right? And say, okay, this is what we're seeing. Here's where the misses are. So whether it was, looking at check-ins, how consistently are we doing check-ins? And then realizing that in some cases we have the check-in frequency wrong for certain metrics, as we just don't measure them at that pace that we had set up. And so just kind of iterating through that. So as we've gone through now, 3 quarterly business reviews looking at this, we've really been able to kind of tighten up kind of how we utilize the software. And we just had a meeting a few weeks back as we're preparing to move into our next budget year and how we take the next step on QBRs, I'm sorry, on OKRs. And it's really about better synergies across the organization. So instead of having siloed type performance metrics, really understanding the role that everyone plays. So like one of our OKRs is to be a destination employer. So obviously every manager through the organization has a role to play there in terms of performance reviews, one-on-one meetings with staff. And so tracking that, again, across the organization, that's not specific to collections or whatever.
Right. So, which means you are using obviously Profit.co for tracking OKRs, right? Now, these performance reviews that you are referring to, are they business performance reviews, or are they also employee performance reviews also being done in Profit.co?
So we're not doing employee reviews in Profit Co. What we're tracking though is that the one-on-one manager meetings
Okay.
are happening, right? So that's our metric in terms of one of our metrics for destination employer is our managers having those reoccurring frequent one-on-one conversations and hearing directly from the employee. So that's we think is a critical measure to improve from a destination
Sure.
employer perspective.
I think that's a very important point, right? So it's not just about tracking the goals, but how the goals are being executed and just tracking the execution, right? Just in this case, that whether meetings are happening and just that Profit.co allows you to conduct meetings and review meetings, record those meetings, have the summary of the meetings, all of that to be available, and it looks like you're taking full advantage of that part of the platform, right? So that's really amazing. Now, apart from this, if we probably switch gears and if we have to look back at over the last 12 months, 18 months, what has been the value right? I would say, that you feel OKRs have brought to the table what Profit.co has brought to the table, right? What would be your response to that? Yeah.
Yeah, again, I think the value is to really try to focus. Again, there are so many things going on, so many projects always happening, to really pull back, and if something comes up, say, okay, which of our 4 OKRs does this fall under? Because those are our priorities, strategically. So I think that's the biggest area. And again, we still have a tendency to want to take on everything. That's just who we are, but that's the practice.
Okay, great. So ability to really help you focus, right? So, I think that has been a, pretty huge issue, and value, right? That's really amazing. Apart from that, in terms of your goal achievement itself, right? Pre-OKRs, pre-profit.co versus, post OKR, post-profit.co, are you seeing improvement in terms of, the percentage of, let's say, goal achievement, or overall, has it really started impacting the culture of the organization as such? What has been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing improvements in terms of actual results. I mean, we've had KPIs in the past, as I said. This just allows us to focus. So, for example, if there's a request from marketing, marketing is going to look at the request and ensure it fits in with one of our OKRs. And if it falls out of that, then it's not that they won't do it, it just is not a priority. So it allows us to keep our priorities straight as we have limited resources like any nonprofit. And so always try to center back to, is this one of the 4 OKRs that we said are critical for us? If not, again, not that we're not going to do it, but it's going to take a back seat to something else that does feed directly into those OKRs. So yeah, we've seen improvement in terms of, actual, days supply of blood, for example, which is, a critical one of ours. Again, we're tracking one-on-one, employment, manager-employee relations. So that's been good. Developing one of our OKRs was around our labs, and so really developing better KPIs through the lab process is also something that's been occurring. So yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, I think those are 3 wonderful examples, right? And I really love the idea, of a destination employer, right? That's really looks like a great goal to aspire towards, right? That's really amazing, and the way that you are tracking it through the one-on-one meetings as well as the day supply of blood. I mean, looks like a very, very crucial, KPI, and I'm glad that you are seeing, improvements in all these key KPIs, right, with your OKR program, right? So that's congratulations towards that. That's amazing. Now, in terms of, just in terms of some questions, for people who are going to, let's say, adopt OKRs, what has been the effort that's been required in Q1 versus Q2 versus Q3? Do you see a change in terms of the amount of effort that you need to put on in the program itself, right? Are you seeing some efficiencies? What has been your experience?
Yeah, like I said, as we've learned the software and dial in the software, it's gotten easier, right? So initially, again, who's recording that, who's supposed to be doing that check-in. That check-in was supposed to be weekly, it should really be monthly, right? As that's happened, right, we've been able to dial that in, so it feels like less effort is required.
Okay.
And then just kind of delegating out who's going to take responsibility for owning those measurements. Something we've done, I don't know if we'll always do this, but over the last year, is we have one of our executive team members leading what we call an OKR group. So we have a specific group around destination employer, a specific group around exceptional blood supply, that sort of thing. Just so there's an executive leader, right, kind of looking at that. And that's been helpful. So they meet periodically just to reevaluate, right? Are we missing any key measures? Do we need to think about changing this as we move forward to the next year? But so yeah, I think time commitment has been less as we've dialed that in.
That's awesome. And also, One other question I wanted to ask is that, as you are setting up these goals, these top 4 OKRs, as you have said, how often do people check in on their goals, and how often do you review, right, the OKRs as an organization? How do you go about it?
Yeah, so each leader is looking at their OKRs weekly. At a leadership team, we tend to look at them more monthly and quarterly, unless something is not progressing as it should, right? So we do a deep dive at the end of each quarter, because the start of this was to break these things down into 90-day segments, right? What can you do in the next 90 days to avoid um, the trap of overanalysis, right? Which again, we're a highly regulated environment, and so sometimes we get stuck in that. We're trying to plan for the perfect, and you never start any motion forward. So the idea was, no, what are we going to get done in the next 90 days? And then let's be aggressive, but let's be honest in measuring what we actually accomplished. And so that's why the deep dive, on a quarterly basis.
Okay, got it. So by the end of the quarter, you do a reflection of the goals and see, what has been adopted, and then you plan for the next quarter based on that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of reviews, right? When you do the reviews, right, are you seeing cases where let's say problems surfacing a bit early to give you enough time for the teams to respond when you do the monthly reviews? What has been the process? A lot of times people want to know, how do you conduct these reviews? What are the best practices to bring out the best out of the program? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously focus on things that are listed as off track,
Okay.
when a check-in's happening. Um, that would, kind of raise the awareness of it. And that's our expectation, that again, having an executive sponsor that's kind of overseeing each of these OKRs would be able to raise a red flag to the leadership team if we're well off track on something. We're really well aware of the other, KPIs, so nothing really would be a surprise, but that's the process.
Okay. I think that's really, super helpful, right, about how to do the reviews. And I think overall, and I would say a lot of valuable advice for people who are going to be doing OKRs, right? So as a closing, maybe just a couple of last questions. One, in this 18-month journey, right, are there any, I would say, significant events or anecdotes that you can think of, right? Any interesting things related to OKRs which really stand out, right, among all this experience that you can share? That
Well, I think, for one, the opportunity to celebrate success on a quarterly basis, and some of the simple dashboard kind of visuals is helpful. And again, as your team have joined us, because we don't have any insight outside of our organization necessarily on OKRs, and so as your team shares with us kind of how we're doing in relation to other entities you've worked with and where we're at in our maturity level. So that's been encouraging, right, to get a little bit of a third-party perspective to say, yeah, actually, you're doing pretty well there, right? Because we're always aiming for perfection. So I think that's been good to celebrate those small wins as you go, to keep the momentum going. And as I said, otherwise, it's really about walking it down through the entire organization. And ideally, we want to get to the point where it's really bottom up, right? That as individual staff members are looking at what they're doing, they would understand how those things bubble up to the mission of the San Diego Blood Bank.
Okay, got it. I think that's very helpful. Now, probably as a closing question, right, or a closing comment from your side, if you were to advise people who are, another nonprofit, right, who are about to embark on an OKR journey, right, what would be your advice to them to, let's say, make this program a success, right? What do you think they should plan for? They should be prepared. right? What would be your advice there?
Yeah, I think starting with some education on what is an OKR, how does it differ from, the typical KPIs maybe that they're working with, right? And so, for us, the idea that no, we want um, these OKRs to be aspirational, right? This is where we're trying to get to, right? If we don't push ourselves, we're not going to get there. Which means if you're being aspirational in your goal setting like that, it means you're going to miss. And this is something I took away from a book that I read is that, at some level you have to be okay with not being 100% all the time. Because if you're setting goals that you're going to hit 100% all the time, then you're not stretching yourself. So I think that education, depending on the organization, being comfortable with the fact that we're going to stretch a little bit, and if we only get to 95% of that stretch goal, that's still better than we were going to be if we were just setting our original goal at 85% or whatever. So, but again, I think that's just education depending on the organization.
Okay, great. I think very valuable insight, right? So, Doug, thank you very much again, right, for the wonderful recount of your 18-month OKR journey. So, folks would love to, convey our thanks and gratitude to Douglas Morton, CEO of San Diego Blood Bank, for, sharing your deep insights and experiences, right? So, thank you very much, Doug.
Of course. Thank you for your time.